Welcome everybody to this afternoon's seminar under the programme of the Political Economy of Financial Markets. A very warm day today. We have in this seminar Daniel Susskind, who is a fellow of Balliol College. Formerly was a special advisor in the Cabinet Office, and before that was a special advisor in the number 10 policy unit. Is that correct?
Not a special advisor, not a political one. But
oh, okay. So you're not a SPAD then?
No.
No. Okay.
Right. There's an important distinction.
So you were originally working under Gordon Brown, but then transitioned into the Cameron government. Is that right?
So that's an official order there. Yeah.
And before that, you were educated both here in Oxford at Balliol and also at Harvard.
That's right. So Balliol and then went to the US for it.
Anyway, Daniel is now going to talk about technology and the future of the labour market, but by which I assume you mean the march of the robots. Is that kind of the general?
In that direction.
Okay,
yeah.
right.
Okay.
Well, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. What I want to do in the next 40 minutes or so is I'm going to talk through 7 things about how technology is affecting the world of work. The first is I just want to outline a history of how people have thought about how technology is affecting work. I want to try and explain what the current consensus is, at least in the economics profession, about the nature of technological change and how it affects work. I want to explain a problem with the way in which the economics literature currently thinks about technological change. I want to set out 2 explanations for why this problem's occurred, one that's being developed in the most recent literature, but another one which is the one that I've been developing, and I think it's an important part of the story as well. I then want to break off and set out a very different approach and give you a flavour of some of the results that come from that, and then just raise some of the implications that this might have, both for how we think about the problem, but also from a public policy point of view as well. And then open up to questions, and I'm sure lots of people have lots of interesting thoughts, so we'll have lots of time for that. I should say that what I'm going to try and do today is a balancing act. So I know there are some economists in the room, but I also know there are some people who aren't economists. And some economists might be frustrated at the lack of technical analysis in this. Some of the non-economists might be puzzled by some of the technical analysis in it. What I'm about to say today is based on a set of papers that I've written I've been working on over the past few years, and if you are interested in the ideas that I'm talking about, then do have a look at those papers and at your own pace. So first the history. One of the most striking things about the labour market in the 20th century is this chart here. This is the skills premium, and this is in the US. So this is the ratio of the return to a college education, the wage if you have a college education relative to the wage that if you don't have a college education. And what you see is this relatively persistent increase from about mid to late 1970s onwards in the skills premium. And this was a puzzle, because at the same time as the relative return to a college education was increasing, there was also a huge number of people pouring out of, in particular in the US, pouring out of universities and colleges in the US. So the question was, how can we reconcile these 2 things? How can we reconcile on the one hand that people seem to be being paid more if they go to college, with on the other hand, we seem to be producing so many graduates, and economics tells us that if you increase the supply of something, their price ought to fall. So how can we reconcile these 2 things? One of the arguments developed was that technological change is the answer, and in particular an idea called skills-biased technological change. And the idea is that remarkable technological progress in the 20th century meant that, yes, the supply of graduates was increasing, but so was the demand for them. All these new technologies required skilled people to design and operate them, and as a result, the demand for these workers outstripped the increasing supply of them, and that's why we see this relatively stable upward relationship between the return to college relative to those who don't go to college. So that's the 20th century. The 19th century, if you step back, is a very different story. Many people in here will be familiar with the story of the Luddites. It's a story in the 19th, 18th century and it's an apocryphal story about Ned Ludd, who was a fictional craftsman who is said to have, in frustration, smashed a set of framing machines at the start of the Industrial Revolution. That's the story. But it's certainly, although Ned himself is very unlikely to have existed, there was a huge amount of discontent during the Industrial Revolution at the introduction of these machines. In fact, in 1812, the British Parliament passed an act which was called the, I can't remember the exact name, but it had as the price associated with it a death penalty. So if you smashed a framing machine in 1812, 1813, you'd be put to death. And this is what happened in 1813, the year after this act was passed. Several people were put to death for smashing machines. So it was a significant problem at the time. The interesting thing, though, about it is, leaving aside that story, the interesting thing about it is that technological change, at least in the 19th century, the early 19th century, appears to be unskilled bias. Ned Ludd and his fellow travellers were the skilled workers at the time. They were the craftsmen, the artisans. And what technology was doing there was displacing skilled workers from their work and making it far easier for unskilled people to do the work that once would have required a skilled person. So you see a very different story of technological change in the 19th century and to an extent in the 18th century as well, relative to the 20th century. One where technological change is unskilled bias rather than skilled bias. Then what happens at the turn of the 21st century is you see both those things happening at the same time. You see apparently a bias towards low-skilled workers, apparently a bias also towards high-skilled workers, but those in the middle of the labour market suffer. So on the slide there, on the far side, so on your left-hand side, are smooth changes in employment by skill percentile from 1980 to 2005. And what you see is that at the bottom of the skills distribution, you see quite a lot of growth in employment. At the top, you see quite a lot of growth in employment, but the middle is not characterised by growth. Similarly, you have a look at smooth changes in real hourly wages by skill percentile from 1980 to 2005. Right at the top, you see growth. At the bottom, you see a slightly more complicated story, but generally growth as well. But in the middle, again, there's something very different happening. And this is, there's lots of names associated with this, things like hollowing out of the labour market, the polarisation of the labour market. And so the challenge many labour economists thought was to try and explain this U-shape that was appearing in the labour market in both employment and in earnings. And so what emerges is the consensus that is very, very influential today, and it's called the ALM hypothesis, after Orta, Levy, and Murnane, who are the co-authors of a very influential paper in 2003. And the thesis goes something like this. So it's a thesis about the nature of technological change and, as a result, what it's capable of doing. And the thesis is that computer capital substitutes for workers in carrying out a limited and well-defined set of cognitive and manual activities, those that can be accomplished by following explicit rules, what we would term routine tasks. And secondly, that computer capital complements workers in carrying out problem-solving and complex communication activities, non-routine tasks. So this is the hypothesis that's developed to explain this polarization story. So really, what it boils down to are two assumptions. The first, a distinction between routine and non-routine tasks. And then secondly, an assumption that capital can only perform routine tasks. And so the intuition for this, without going into too much detail, is, and it's important to say a little bit on it though, is that routine tasks require, according to these authors, explicit knowledge. Non-routine tasks rely upon tacit knowledge. So explicit knowledge is the sort of thing that human beings find very easy to articulate. Very easy to say how it is they perform a particular task or activity. Conversely, tacit knowledge, very difficult to articulate, very difficult to explain the knowledge that we're drawing on in performing a task or activity. Some of you might recognise it comes from the work of Polanyi, who's not a traditional economist, he's more of a philosopher and a sociologist. But the assumption is that machines can only perform a task if it set explicit rules that reflect this knowledge that human beings rely upon. But since human beings can't articulate how they perform non-routine tasks, rules cannot be written for machines to follow to perform non-routine tasks. So this is the idea. Routine tasks and non-routine tasks, we can't get machines to perform non-routine tasks Because basically human beings can't explain how it is they perform those tasks. So how on earth can we write a set of rules for a machine to follow if human beings can't explain them? So author 2015, the scope for this kind of substitution is bounded because there are many tasks that people understand tacitly and accomplish effortlessly, but for which neither computer programmers nor anyone else can enunciate the explicit rules or procedures. So that's the idea. And the reason it explains this story, just to go back to these charts, is because one of the interesting things is that when you break down jobs and look at the sorts of tasks that make them up, it turns out that jobs in the middle of the skills distribution, middle skilled jobs, have a very high routine task component. It's far easier to automate tasks in the center of the skills distribution than it is at either end. Now, we might not be surprised that the tasks at the top of the skills distribution are non-routine. You may think of a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor. We tend to think those sorts of things are non-routine, very difficult to explain how you perform tasks that require things like judgment or empathy or creativity. But one of the interesting findings was that actually there's a lot of non-routine tasks at the bottom of the skills distribution. Things which we tend to think of being as low skilled, tend to think of as being low paid, things like caring or hairdressing or gardening or personal training. Actually, a lot of the tasks involved in those have traditionally been non-routine as well. So that's the story and that's the hypothesis, that in the middle of the skills distribution we've got all these routine tasks, we can automate them. At either end are non-routine tasks and they're out of reach of automation. And that seems to do a good job of explaining what happened in the 21st century. But there's a problem with this though, and it's a problem that's appeared in the past 5 or 10 years, and it's this, which is that the ALM hypothesis, it's got a very clear implication if you take it seriously as it's written, which is that machines can't perform non-routine tasks. Human beings can't articulate how they perform them. How can we write a set of rules for a machine to follow? And there's a lot of support in the data for this from 1960 to 1998, but there's less support in the data later on. One of the surprising things is if you look at the task input into the US economy over that latter period, you'd expect to see the new non-routine task inputs, labour task inputs increasing, and actually they don't. They start falling off, and in some cases falling altogether. But I suppose the more significant point is just anecdotally, many of the cases that are proposed by the literature, and when you pick them out, can now be computerized. Things that 14 years ago were inconceivable that we could automate, we can now automate. So this is a table from the paper. That right-hand column, non-routine tasks, truck driving, one example. Auto navigating a car through city traffic or deciphering the scrawled handwriting. Not routine tasks by definition. The reason is that these tasks require visual and motor processing capabilities that cannot at present be described in a set of programmable rules. And yet, of course, today we have most major car manufacturers saying that within 18 to 24 months we're going to see driverless cars on our roads. Or take another one, medical diagnosis, non-routine cognitive task in this case. Again, why do we think this task can't be automated? Well, if you sit down with a doctor and say, tell me how it is you make a diagnosis, they'll say things like, it's gut reaction, it's instinct, it's intuition. And those things are very difficult to articulate. And so traditionally we thought it would be very difficult to write a set of rules for a machine to follow. Start of this year, paper published in Nature describing a system that if you take a photo of a freckle, it will give you as accurate a diagnosis about whether or not that freckle is cancerous as 22 leading dermatologists. What's interesting about this, just while it's on the screen, if you look at the final co-author on that paper, Sebastian Thrun, those who follow the world of artificial intelligence will know that he was the person who in 2005 designed the first driverless car. The sorts of systems that are being designed to perform non-routine tasks in very different domains can be applied, relatively similar systems can be applied in other domains. So let me explain where's this problem come from? Why has this occurred? The first explanation is the one that's been proposed in the recent literature. It recognizes that lots of technological progress has taken place, but it maintains that hypothesis, that distinction between non-routine and routine tasks. And what it basically argues is that what technology is doing is it's moving the boundary between non-routine and routine tasks. So tasks that we thought were non-routine are in fact far more routine than we realized. What we're doing is we're using technology, according to this explanation, to uncover, to discover those tacit rules that traditionally human beings have found very difficult to articulate. And that's what's been proposed in the most recent literature. But there's then a different explanation, and this is the one that I I think is more important, which is it recognizes recent technological progress, but it challenges the ALM hypothesis. And the argument here is that the non-routine routine distinction is just simply no longer a compelling way to think about the constraints in automation. And here, technology allows machines to perform tasks in such a way that that distinction between non-routine and routine tasks no longer applies. And this is the argument that I make in one of my recent working papers. So why do I think this is a better explanation? Well, remember, just go back to that hypothesis. It's based on the idea that we can only perform tasks if we can articulate the rules that human beings follow. But these new systems and machines are performing tasks in very different ways to human beings. And what that means is it's no longer necessary for the rules that human beings follow for the rules that machines follow to resemble the rules that human beings follow. The inability of human beings to articulate their thinking processes, which traditionally has been a constraint, is no longer a constraint. Through technological progress, we can now, and in particular, lots of processing power and lots of data storage capability and various advances in algorithm design, we can now perform tasks in fundamentally different ways. So let's just go back to this example. Why is it that we can now diagnose whether or not a particular freckle is cancerous? It's not because we found out the rules that doctors are following and we've got a system that does that. What we've got is a system that has a database of about 140,000 photos of freckles labeled according to whether or not they were cancerous, and it's running essentially a pattern recognition algorithm through those images. It's performing the task in a very, very different way. The traditional constraint on automating medical diagnosis, which was that human beings couldn't explain really precisely how it was that they did medical diagnosis so well, that's no longer a constraint. So what I think we need is an alternative approach for thinking about how technological change affects work. What is it that technological change can do? And I think the important idea here is routinizability. So this distinction between whether or not a task is routine or non-routine from the standpoint of a human being, it's no longer the appropriate criteria. What we need is a set of criteria that tell us whether the task is routinizable from the standpoint of a machine. What do I mean by routinizable? It's routinizable if a routine can be composed that allows a machine to perform the task, but that routine may not necessarily reflect the way a human being performs it. And it nests. It's a more general hypothesis about what it is that machines can do. It nests the Autor-Levy-Murnane hypothesis as a special case. In particular, when the only way to perform a task is to replicate the way a human being performs the task, then we need to know the rules that it is human beings are following to perform that task. But that's just a special case. There's, of course, a vast range of possible other cases where the rules don't need to resemble the rules that human beings follow. So I think routinizability is the more important concept here. So let me just share some of the results that I think you get when you change the assumptions that you make about how it is that machines operate. What I want you to do is I want you to imagine an economy made up of lots and lots of different goods. So each of these grey dots is a particular good. And I want you to take one good, and I want you to imagine that each good is produced by combining two different types of tasks. You have one task which is performed by what I want you to think of as traditional capital. And this is the traditional conception of capital, the old-fashioned conception of capital. And then I want you to imagine another task that's performed by labour. And these two tasks combine and they produce goods. Except the additional thing I want you to consider is that this second task isn't just be performed by labour, but it might also be performed by this new type of capital, advanced capital, which is able to compete with labour at the sorts of tasks that traditionally only human beings have been best placed to do. So given there's lots of goods, there's of course going to be lots of these tasks where labour and advanced capital are jousting for comparative advantage, jousting to see who's best placed to perform those tasks. And now I want you to imagine lining up all those tasks from the simplest tasks to the most complex tasks. And I want you to imagine that as those tasks get more and more complex, human beings have the comparative advantage. They get relatively better at them. And one way of thinking about this formally, and I don't want to go into too much detail in this, I just want to give you a flavour of what it is that I'm talking about. That story is captured by this diagram here. So what we have at the bottom there is, again, imagine a spectrum of tasks, all the tasks lined up, each of them with a label from somewhere between 0 to 1. So you've got the task 0.0001, 0.002, all the way along. And then on the y-axis, you have the relative wage of labour with respect to the return to advanced capital. And you've got this schedule which slopes up. And this is a relative productivity schedule. So what it means is, if you take any one of those tasks at the bottom, it will tell you the relative price of labour at which a firm will be indifferent between hiring either labour or traditional capital. And it's upward sloping because as you move rightwards and labour gets more and more productive relative to capital, if a firm's going to remain indifferent between the two things, the relative wage has to rise. Because otherwise, if the relative wage fell, they'd want to use more labour rather than less. So this is a relative productivity schedule. There's then another schedule, which is a market clearing schedule. And this schedule tells us So I want you to now imagine we're in a setting of what economists call perfect competition. So all factors are paid according to exactly what it is that they contribute to output. And this schedule here plots the relative wages for each task I at which factors are paid what they produce. So on the far side over there, where I equals 0, advanced capital produces nothing. And as a result, if advanced capital produces nothing, you've got a wage divided by, and it produces nothing, so it's going to get paid nothing. And you've got a relative wage which shoots off to infinity because you've got something divided by 0. And then similarly in that bottom corner over there, where I equals 1, I want you to imagine that advanced capital does everything. And advanced capital does everything, then the wage that labour's paid, WH, has to be equal to 0. So it's equal to 0. Now the point is that where these two lines intersect is an equilibrium. And what it tells us is an equilibrium cutoff I bar. All those I to the left of I bar, all those tasks to the left of I bar, they're performed by labour. They're performed by advanced capital, sorry. And all the ones to the right, they're performed by labour. And the point that I want, the most important point is this, which is that when this advanced capital becomes more productive, this is the only thing that you have to keep in mind, and this relative productivity schedule falls, that cutoff moves. Advanced capital pushes in to the sorts of tasks that traditionally only labour has performed. And that's the spirit of what's happening here. That advanced capital is eating away, eroding the set of tasks that traditionally only labour's perform. That's the idea. Now this is what economists would call a static model. It's not a dynamic model, and if you look at it, if you model this effect dynamically, what you get is something that looks like this. And this is the pessimistic story. In the top left you have, I suppose the most important part of this story is that bottom right one, which is the wage that gets paid to labour. As this advanced capital eats away at the set of tasks that have traditionally only been done by labour, the wage that's paid to labour falls gradually over time to 0. And if you look to the diagram to the left of that I bar, that cutoff, that boundary that marks out the tasks that are performed by labour and the tasks that are performed by capital, you see that rising to 1. Labour gets pushed into a shrinking set of tasks, and advanced capital does more and more and more and more. So you might ask then, why does this matter? Why does this model matter? Why does this story I've told matter? Well, the traditional argument in the literature, the optimistic argument, is this. And this is what Otto opens one of his 2015 papers with. These questions underline an economic reality that's as fundamental as is overlooked. Tasks that cannot be substituted by automation are generally complemented by it. And what he means here by substituted and complemented is that substituted is straightforward. What he means is that tasks that can't be performed by machines, that labour can't be replaced by capital in. But what he means by complemented is that as you increase the amount of capital in the economy, these tasks become more valuable and more important rather than less valuable and less important. That's what he means by complemented. But why does this matter? Well, I'm not disagreeing with that claim. I'm not saying that tasks that can't be automated are complemented. Tasks that cannot be automated are complemented by traditional capital. I agree with that. Tasks that cannot be automated are complemented by traditional capital. That's simply true. Remember, again, every good requires those two different types of tasks. And there's some tasks which traditional capital doesn't perform, and as this traditional capital becomes more productive and we increase the amount in the economy, all those other tasks that are either done by labour or advanced capital become more valuable rather than less. But what I'm wanting to do is challenge the assumption that necessarily labour will be best placed to perform all those complemented tasks. Advanced capital erodes the set of types of complemented tasks that labour retains a comparative advantage, and labour's forced to specialise in a shrinking set of tasks. So let's just think about this intuitively. There's a set of tasks out there which are either performed by labour or performed by advanced capital. And we've got this traditional capital in the economy, which as we increase the volume of traditional capital and it becomes more, we increase the productivity of it and the quantity of it, it makes all those tasks that are performed by labour or advanced capital more valuable and more important. But at the same time, this advanced capital is eroding that set of tasks that labour might have performed. And that's an important point of pessimism that isn't yet captured in the literature on, isn't yet adequately captured on the literature on technological change. And it's a whirlwind tour of the idea that I've given you there, but if you want to look at it in more detail, you can go to the formal paper as well. So let me just close with some of the implications, some of the questions that these ideas might have raised. The first is just theoretical ones. One of the things you might say to me, Dan, is, Daniel, look, that's all very interesting, but one of the things that happens as an economy grows is that demand shifts, demands change. You have lots of goods in your economy, and yes, it may be that this new advanced capital displaces labour from performing certain types of tasks, but surely, demand will increase for other goods in the economy, and labour can produce those goods instead. And I think that's an important argument, and it's an argument, though, that only works if demand shifts towards goods which labour, rather than advanced capital, is best placed to perform. So there's a set of important theoretical questions that have to be looked at about whether or not that is the case. Then there's another point, which is that, look, Daniel, that's all very interesting, but remember, that bundle of goods you had at the beginning, there was only a fixed number of goods. And one of the things that we know is that over time, we create entirely new goods and services, perhaps we can't even conceive of today, and labour can move into producing those things instead. And I think that was also a good argument. That's an important argument. But again, what this story suggests is that we have to look again at the tasks that have to be done to produce those new goods. Because if demand shifts to new goods, but those new goods in turn just require advanced capital rather than labour to produce them, that's not a reason for optimism. So what you get is a sense that there might be a new race. Traditionally, remember, go back to the 20th century, that skills bias story, the race was between technology and education. That's the famous title of a book by Golden and Katz. The race was between technology and education. Technology was becoming more and more productive, more and more impressive. And so in order to keep up with technology, what we wanted to do was we wanted to put as many people through university and college as possible to give them the skills so that they were the sorts of people who were able to put these increasingly capable systems to good use. But the story that emerges here is very different. The race here isn't between technology and education, but it seems to be a race between labour being displaced from certain tasks by advanced capital and hoping that new tasks are created elsewhere in the economy, which advanced capital can't do and labour can. And that's a very different dynamic and a very different type of race. And I think that is a race that will be important in the 21st century. There's then a set of empirical questions. First, how do we measure this idea of routinizability I opened with at the beginning? The idea of routineness is quite straightforward. It's quite, it's difficult, but straightforward conceptually to think about. But what is it that makes a task easy to write a routine for, if we free ourselves from the constraint that that routine might have to resemble how human beings perform it? Now, one interesting observation that Andrew Ng made, he's now the chief AI scientist at Baidu in China, he made the point that machine learning specialists, when they're looking for a task to automate, they look for something that human beings might take less than a second to decide upon, less than a second to do. And that for him is a criteria for whether or not it might be easy to routinize. And I think what's interesting about that, of course, is that is in direct contrast to the ALM hypothesis. Tasks that you do in less than a second tend to be the sorts of things that you actually struggle to articulate how you do. Think about all the things you do instinctively or intuitively that you can do very quickly. When pushed to explain how it is you do them, it's very difficult. And what seems to be the case is that actually those tasks in certain cases are easier rather than harder to automate. There's then an interesting set of issues around the task composition of the economy. As our economy grows and changes and new goods and services have to be produced, how are the tasks that have to be done in the economy changing? How have they changed in the past, and how are they likely to change in the future? At the moment, we don't have lots of good data on that, and clearly, if these sorts of arguments are important arguments, then understanding how the task composition of the economy has changed and is likely to change in the future is important. Then I think there's a set of important policy questions, and I just want to say a little bit about them. They're two quite different things. The first is the labour market. The 20th century conception of technological change, this skills bias story, again, it's the idea that technological change creates systems and machines that require skilled people who are able to use them, who are able to understand them, who are able to put them to good use. And so what we need to do is we need to give people more skills. We need to get more people through college and university. Now, what this story suggests is that actually it's more complicated than that. Remember, just go back to that diagram, the polarized story. Yes, it may be true that there are some tasks, non-routine, traditionally non-routine, or non-routinizable tasks at the top of the economy. And it may still be the case that the best way to get a job with those tasks is to go the traditional route and go to university and go to college, and that's the way to go. But remember, there's actually also lots of jobs with tasks at the bottom of the economy as well, which are non-routinizable. And those sorts of jobs, well, there's lots of problems with those sorts of jobs, but one problem is that that traditional university college route is not the traditional route to getting those jobs. The second point about those jobs is that although many of them are socially quite important, certain types of teaching, certain types of caring, tasks that require certain types of interpersonal skills that are quite difficult to automate. Although they are socially very important, the market tends not to value them as highly as other occupations, and so there's a set of challenges there. But this general idea that the way in which we best prepare people for the labour market is to give them the sorts of skills and capabilities that you might need to do the stuff at the top doesn't necessarily hold. But there's also a question about whether or not traditional college and traditional university education is the best way to get those jobs at the top as well. You have people like Peter Thiel, slightly provocatively, but also slightly seriously, offering bursaries of $100,000 to people who don't go to university to start up companies and to train in various types of digital skills. That's a very, very different way of thinking about how you get those jobs at the top relative to that traditional skills bias view. I think there's then, and this is perhaps, I think, one of the most important points, a set of challenges around inequality. One of the consequences of this model, again, where you have this set of things that labour does, which are made more valuable by one type of capital, but another type of capital erodes them and forces labour to shrink in a shrinking set of them, is that the labour share of income becomes far bigger over time. If you imagine the economy as a big pie, and a slice of the pie goes to workers in the form of wages, and the rest goes to owners of these types of capital, owners of companies in the form of profit and rent, that second slice we call the capital share of income. We've seen in certain countries, to different rates over the past few years, that capital share rising. In this model, it rises all the way to 1 in the end, so that the entire economy is consumed by capital. All the returns, all the productive returns in the economy go to people who own capital. Now that suggests that from an inequality point of view, the challenge isn't a problem about inequality of income. It's not a problem about inequality between different wages that workers get, but it's a challenge of inequality between people who are working and those people who own these increasingly capable systems and machines. And that's a very different type of challenger, I think, to the traditional way in which many people have thought about inequality in the 20th century. I mean, it's interesting as an economist when you look at the literature on what it is you ought to tax. There's a fantastic literature on optimal labour taxes. But when you look at the literature on optimal capital taxes, you tend to come to the conclusion that we ought not to tax capital, that taxing capital distorts incentives to invest, to save over time. It will set the economy on a trajectory, on a lower trajectory than you might set it if people didn't save as much didn't save as much to invest in capital. And if this is right, and capital inequality is going to be an increasing part of an increasing challenge in the coming decades, then I think revisiting this idea that that the thing we ought to tax is labour rather than capital, I think is another significant policy question, policy challenge. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.